Thank you very much, Paula Albrito, for giving the opportunity and for inviting me here in the session to as a panelist to assess and draw insights and experiences of the national governments in building back better in recovery from disasters. As you see, the situation in the world that we live right now have changed significantly due to the onset of COVID-19. We are aware that water-related disasters such as floods and droughts will continue to be an imminent threat in countries and cities under the COVID-19 pandemic. Challenges on disaster risk reduction strategies and actions are still increasing, especially designed for the current pandemic situation that will protect us from flood and droughts in the affected areas from becoming epicenters of pandemic explosion. In the Philippines, we are always visited by 21 typhoons a year. And out of these 21 typhoons, around three develop into destructive ones. Given that flood disasters has occurred during the pandemic here in the Philippines, specifically on November 12, 2020, with Typhoon Bamko, a powerful and deadly Category 4 equivalent typhoon that struck the capital city of Manila, and it was the worst flooding in the Philippines since Typhoon Ketsana in 2009. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I will be showing you the efforts that we have undertaken to build back better after Typhoon Ketsana in 2009. Well, in 2020, we were visited by four typhoons that are supposed to be spread out in the months, rainy seasons, but actually affected us in the whole month of November. So it started with Typhoon Bamko, and this affected around 3 million people in 8 provinces or 8 regions, leaving it devastated. Next slide. The most affected area is the capital city of Metro Manila, wherein the headwaters or the watershed of the upper Marikina River Basin was heavily inundated, and the areas were heavy with runoff, so much that the floodwaters in our man-made channels, our floodways, these were overtopped. The main thoroughfare, the EDSA, this is the main thoroughfare in Metro Manila, this was flooded, and even the cities and municipalities around the biggest lake in the Philippines, which is the Laguna Lake, was also heavily inundated. Next. When disaster data came in, around around 6,000 barangays and around 4 million people were affected during that time. And when it comes to damage in agriculture, around 4 billion pesos in Philippine pesos were registered, and the damage to infrastructure around 9 billion pesos. Next slide, please. When we tried to have a grasp of what happened, we were able to get the facts and the findings regarding this, the water level and the peak discharges in this Pasig Marikina River Basin, and the ways forward on how we can address this. We try to address this through our structural and non-structural measures. Next slide. For the rainfall, we were able to compare between Typhoon Ketsana in blue and then Typhoon Bampo in green, and almost similar amount of rainfall. But in the case of Typhoon Ketsana, the amount of runoff or the rainfall was just gentle, but in the case of Typhoon Bampo, it was very rapid, causing immediate flooding or inundation in the upstream portion. Next slide. In terms of water level in our main river in Pasig Marikina River Basin, we saw that there was a double amplitude in the case of Typhoon Ketsana, whereas in Typhoon Bamko, this was gentle, and this was less than the amount of Typhoon Ketsana. And why heavy flooding didn't occur around the area of that Laguna Lake? Because during that time, the Laguna Lake was not at its peak, meaning it was in low elevation during that rainfall. Next slide. When we look at the watershed of the Pasig Marikina, we saw that over the years, the heavily building up or the urbanization of this watershed is being experienced. Those in color in red and it shows that the runoff is being amplified because of this building up of areas in the watershed. Next slide. Since Typhoon Ketsana in 2009, in 2012, our government has been aggressive in putting in money and budget to construct structural and both non-structural measures. And this is part of the priority to strengthen the disaster risk reduction of the capacity of the government. And you can see that the budget in terms of color orange, you see that this is amplified over the years. Next slide. And for roads, bridges, and flood control, again, we are very robust in putting in the budget to mitigate this flood disaster mitigation structures and interventions. Next slide. And when we started building, we found out that the damage actually, although they are almost of the same magnitude, the damage actually was lesser this time as compared in the 2009 flood. And with the floodway and the river channels that we are constructing, actually the Metro Manila area was spared 85% from the damage. Next slide. And there are many more projects that we need to implement, such as more floodways, the spillway, and of course, the improvement of the waterways that I will be showing you. Next slide. And you can see that these are the structures that we are implementing over the years. Next slide, including the floodways. Next slide, please. And the sluice gates that divert the flow from the natural waterway into the man-made channels. And overall, we learned that based on the robust or aggressive funding, pre-investment funding by the government, we can ensure that disaster risk reduction can be implemented and to start recovery in order to build back better for a whole of government approach for a big disaster such as flood disaster. And with that, I would like to end my presentation here and thank you for this opportunity for inviting me to be in this panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fano. I think your presentation really provided concrete examples and highlights what is needed to have a sustainable approach to recovery and risk reduction. I would like to ask you, zooming out and based on your presented experience, what adjustments or critical measures must be taken to ensure the building back better is no longer treated as an option, but is actually applied in all the recovery initiatives?
Yes, just like the experience of Japan in 2015, the word or the term "build back better" was actually a small appreciation in during the time. Here in the Philippines, we always incorporate, or we try to incorporate this in much of our projects, so that we try to build back projects that will ensure the disaster risk reduction in mitigating floods in our case, and of course making the structures more receptive to the needs by improving its design, increasing the design capacities, the parameters, and of course taking into climate change adaptation strategies that will strengthen and make sure that our structures are responsive to the damages or to the magnitude of the floods.